We are now halfway through 2022, amazingly, and so I want to look back on the first half of the year and see what the best books that have come out in 2022 so far have been. But I do have a few caveats. One, I'm not going to talk about any non-fiction because I haven't read a lot, so I'm going to keep this to fiction, which means I'm not going to be mentioning this, I Want to Die But I Want to Eat Tteokbokki by Baek Se-hee, translated by Anton He from Korean into English. I love this book. Absolutely, 2 pieces, it would be in my top 10, but I'm not doing non-fiction. I'm also not mentioning any books that have come out or will be out in July that I've already read. For example, Life Ceremony by Sayaka Murata, translated by Jini Tapley Takimori. I'm going to be doing a review of this very, very soon. Look forward to that. And finally, this is not a definitive list. There are books that came out in the first half of the year that I've probably just forgotten about, or books that I haven't read yet. For example, these 2. This is Scattered All Over the Earth by Yoko Tawada, one of my favourite Japanese authors. And this is Lapvona by Otessa Moshfegh, who is an author I've never read before and I really, really need to. I'm excited to read both of these books, but I haven't read them yet, so I can't talk about them. Maybe they'd be in this top 10 if I'd already read them. With all that out of the way, this is my top 10 books of the first half of 2022 so far, all fiction, all released between January and June. At number 10, I've picked The Deloread by Missouri Williams. I think this was a really groundbreaking and strange piece of fiction that did a lot really well with its inspiration. It's a really shocking and frightening and scary book that kind of remind me at times of the works of Cormac McCarthy, works that sometimes feel like they exist just to frighten you. But it also had a lot to say about the dynamics of families and social circles and closed networks of community. It's a post-apocalyptic story about a strange incestuous family that lives in a small community in the Czech Republic, and it's about cult dynamics, and it kind of makes you think about how families and small communities have a cult-like nature to them. It's a really disturbing book, and it does potentially have some underpinnings of ableism. I'm not sure how I feel about that. As someone who isn't disabled, it's not really my place to say, but I did see some arguments about that, so I'm cautiously recommending this book with that kind of as a caveat. It's disturbing and frightening and very punk, and I loved it to pieces for all of those things because that's what I really love in fiction. So much of my favourite fiction in cinema and literature has elements of shock and horror and grossness to them. I love that stuff. So this made number 10 for that reason. It's not perfect, but I really liked it. At number 9 is a Mexican novel, Paradise by Fernanda Melchor, translated by Sophie Hughes. I absolutely adore the works of Fernanda Melchor. She's probably the most exciting author coming out of Mexico right now, and that was solidified by Hurricane Season, which was a really incredible novel. And I think Paradise isn't quite as good as Hurricane Season. It feels a little bit more stripped back. It kind of reminded me of when a band comes onto the scene with a really exciting debut album that pushes genres and boundaries and does some technical prowess that really impresses you, and then to try and make it a little bit bigger, their second album is slightly stripped down and a bit more radio-friendly and mainstream. I see that a lot in music, and this book kind of gives you that impression, where Hurricane Season was narratively and grammar-wise and structure-wise very shocking and strange and quite a challenging read. Paradise takes some of that away, strips it down, makes it a little bit easier to read, easier to digest. That's not necessarily a bad thing, it makes it more accessible. It treads a lot of the same themes, but it was just a slightly easier and quicker read. I read it in an afternoon. And if you haven't read it, Paradise tells the story of 2 boys, a rich boy and a poor boy. One of them lives in this very wealthy housing estate. The other one works there as a kind of a dog's body gardener. And the 2 of them are both horrible people for different reasons. And they have bonded because one of them uses the other to buy alcohol and food for him, and the rich boy just wants someone to listen to him while he describes all of the disgusting things he wants to do to his neighbour. It's not a nice book, it's really horrible, but it really makes you think about the concept of nature versus nurture, how our situation in life, what we're born into, the society, family, economic situation that we're born into, how that defines us as people, how we're locked into it, how we get trapped by that. It's really poignant in that way. And these characters are interestingly sympathetic for people who are so awful, and I found that really engaging. Number 8 is Violets by Kyung-Suk Shin, translated from Korean into English by Anton He. This is a fantastic book, and I do think it's probably now my favourite Kyung-Suk Shin book. I haven't read all of her books, but of the ones I have read, I think it's the one that impressed me the most. What I really, really liked about Violets is the way that it explored patriarchy and the male gaze in a way that is very subtle and quiet, and therefore kind of stuck in my head more than something loud and shocking. I really appreciate feminist literature that looks at things that often go unexplored or left unsaid, and that's something that Violets does really, really well. It looks at the ways in which men invade women's spaces in a very invisible way that we all just take for granted. I talk about it in my review, which you can go watch. But there are moments in all of our lives where men invade women's spaces by touching their arm, or touching their lower back as they scoot past them in a train aisle. Or they will just go up to a woman and talk to her when she's busy, because they believe they have the right to interrupt women. There's this sense of patriarchy that what a man has to say or do is more important and more valid than what a woman is doing by herself. And there's a lot of moments in the book that explore that, and I really, really appreciate it. It's not narratively perfect. I think it's a little bit disjointed, and there are things that kind of go unanswered, and not in an ambiguous way that's kind of fun or meaningful. It just felt like it could have even been a novella or a short story, like it didn't need to be as long as it was. That's something I've been thinking about since I finished it. So it's not perfect narratively, but I think thematically, it really looks at the male and female gaze in ways that really has you considering social dynamics long after you finish reading it. It really made me rethink the ways in which men and women exist in public spaces together, and that's really valuable. This one took me by surprise. This is a book that I absolutely loved when I read it. It's not groundbreaking literary fiction by any means. It doesn't have a lot to say thematically. It is fun. This is a book that ticked all of my boxes. I just couldn't stop thinking about how much fun I had while reading it, and I think a lot of the books that I've included on this list are here because they are powerful. Thematically, narratively, they left an impact on me because of some politics or philosophy or whatever. This is not that. This is just a really wonderfully fun homage to the legacy of Gothic fiction. The Leviathan by Rosie Andrews is a perfect, over-the-top, caricatured Gothic novel that I absolutely adored. I had so much fun reading this. This is one of the few books that I get to 100 pages in one breath and haven't looked away at any moment. Doesn't happen with me very often because I have ADHD. But I read 100 pages of this and then looked up and thought, oh wow, when did that happen? That's awesome. The Leviathan is set during the English Civil War. It tells the story of a young man who comes home from the war, and his little sister, who's only about 16, is paranoid that their new maid is manipulating their dad, sleeping with him, taking advantage of him, wants something from him. And then in the next chapter, it flits to the future, where our protagonist is now an old man, and there is a monster in his attic that he has to take care of. This monster has been asleep in his attic for decades and has now woken up, and he has to go feed it. It's wild. And I can't really talk about much more without spoiling it, because there is a twist sort of at the end of the first act that is just mind-blowing and makes you connect these two different narratives in an instant. I found this book so much fun because it is camp, it is overblown, it reads like Frankenstein for the 21st century. It's everything I love about Gothic monster fiction. I love The Leviathan. If you haven't read it and that all sounds great, please check it out. Number 6 is All the Lovers in the Night by Miyako Kawakami, translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd from the Japanese. It kind of surprised me that I've put this one so low down, because Breasts and Eggs was my favourite book of 2020, and Heaven was one of my favourite books of last year. So we keep getting new Miyako Kawakami books constantly translated into English, thanks to Sam Bett and David Boyd, and they're always at kind of number 1, number 2 slots, and this one is a little bit lower down. That doesn't mean I disliked it at all. It's still in my top 10. And she consistently ends up in my top 10 because she's my joint favourite Japanese author alongside Sayaka Murata. I can never pick between the two. But All the Lovers in the Night didn't leave an impact the same way Breasts and Eggs and Heaven, and even Ms. Sandwich did. This is a very subtle and quiet book. It explores a lot of the same themes about social dynamics, especially in women, that her other books do. But It's not as loud. And I know I just praised Kyung-Suk Shin's Violets for pretty much that same thing, being more subtle in its exploration of feminism and patriarchy and women's roles in society and all of that. But I think what Violets poked at was specific, whereas this seems more vague and general. Although I'm still putting this higher than Violets on the list, so I guess I'm just surprised it didn't end up number 1 or number 2. But All the Lovers in the Night is just such a quiet book. And I was also really, really depressed when I read it, so that probably factors into it. Maybe I should read it again before the end of the year, before I do my end of year list. It's probably a good idea. Anyway, watch my review if you want to know more about it, but there's a lot that I left unsaid in that review, and a few things that I said in it that I didn't entirely agree with after the fact. Anyway, this is me just having a conversation with myself about how I kind of read this book badly, but I'm putting it in my top 10 because she is wonderful, she is perfect, and I did love it. Into my top 5, and we have a book that I only just finished reading, Briefly A Delicious Life by Nell Stevens. Oh my goodness gracious me. Nell Stevens is already a very accomplished writer, but this is her debut piece of fiction, her debut novel, and it is magnificent. It is so sexy and sensual, but it also really reminded me of Hamnet. Last night I did my Patreon book club for my $10 and up patrons, and in it I talked about what an impact this book had left, because one of my patrons was talking about how much they enjoyed Hamnet. And I said, you know, this actually really reminded me of Hamnet, in the sense that it's about a very famous historical figure, but that figure kind of takes a back seat in order to give more space and room and breathing time to the people around him. Hamnet was about Shakespeare's family, his wife and kids. Briefly A Delicious Life is about the people around Chopin, specifically the French author George Sand, who is an author I'd never come across before, even though according to Wikipedia, she actually outsold people like Victor Hugo at the time when she was writing, especially in Britain. Brits loved her books, apparently. But George Sand was a very interesting character because she used to dress in masculine clothing in order to be freer in public and go where men can go and do what men can do. And she ended up in a love affair with Chopin, and the two of them in this novel go to Mallorca because he has consumption and he's getting real ill. And so they go to a place with clean air and peace and quiet and beautiful scenery. They go to Mallorca with her 2 kids, and the whole novel is told from the perspective of a ghost of a young lesbian girl who haunts the charter house that they stay in and has fallen immediately in love with George Sand and just observes them, just watches these people eating food and relaxing and having sex and having a lovely time. It's such a unique book. I love it. I'm going to do a dedicated video on it, so just look out for that. How High We Go in the Dark by Sequoia Nagamatsu. I did a video on this very recently, and this is my favourite piece of science fiction of this year so far. I am amazed at the breadth and scope and imagination on display here. A lot of what is being explored here has been explored by other authors, and actually I had a lot of great comments in this video that pointed to some of those things. Books that I'd never read, stories I'd never come across, I was really grateful for that. But this is a short story collection disguised as a novel, or the other way around. Every narrative in here, every chapter focuses on a slightly different time, place, and person, but it's all following a continual narrative. It begins with a scientist discovering a disease in the permafrost in the Arctic. That disease then gets unleashed into the water supply, and every story from then shows how that disease has affected society and how human invention, human imagination, and most importantly, human community is fighting back against that disease, adapting to it, and where we go from here. A lot of the best books I've read recently have focused on the concept of community, found family, relationship dynamics, the importance of holding on to each other, and this book really explores that in a beautiful way. It's very, very reminiscent of Station 11 by Emily St. John Mandel, in the sense that it is kind of not post-apocalyptic, but it's about human civilization after it has been radically altered and changed by something very dramatic and frightening, a giant pandemic, and the importance of human community, art, connections, scientific discovery, and the things that humans are able to do for and with one another. It's beautiful. It's very imaginative, it is gorgeous, I love it to pieces. Go watch my video on it if you want to know more. My number 3 book of the year so far is Nettle Black by Nat Reeve. This was a book that was tailor written for me. Nat Reeve didn't know that at the time when they wrote it, but it is. This is perfect. This is absolutely the kind of book that I wish I had written at some point in my life. It is a magnificent piece of camp queer historical fiction that pays homage to so many great British writers like Shakespeare and Dickens, and even Agatha Christie. I can't say enough good things about Nettle Black. It's an epistolary novel. I love epistolary novels. Its protagonist is a sweet and cute and kind young woman who is constantly just overwhelmed and confused and unable to contend with the world around her as she stumbles from event to event, situation to situation, just wondering how she's ended up where she is. And it tells the story of a strange village with a vigilante group in it that try to solve petty crimes. I said in my review it reminds me of Hot Fuzz, the movie. And yeah, it does. It really does. I kept thinking of Hot Fuzz all the way through this, because it's about a small English community with big things happening in it. And everyone in it is so quirky and strange. There is a wonderful non-binary character that I absolutely adored, this wonderful dandy. There's so much to love in this book, so please watch my review, fall in love with this book the way that I did, support Nat Reeve. Nettle Black is amazing. I argued with myself for a while over which would take my number 1 spot. I have 2 favourite books of the year so far that each deserve the number 1 spot for different reasons. So these are kind of on the same level, but I had to pick a 1 and a 2, right? So number 2 is Solo Dance by Lee Kotomi, translated from Japanese by my friend Arthur Reiji Morris, who's currently in Tokyo. I loved Solo Dance. It was a very, very important book for me at a very specific time in my life. I was due to move to Japan. I had made that choice. I had been gearing up to do it for months and months and months. I'd been really excited to do this big change in my life, and then I didn't. And I got very, very depressed and frightened and confused, and I read Solo Dance, a book about a young queer woman with depression and thoughts of suicide. She kind of romanticizes suicide as an escape, as many of us have done. And Solo Dance is a dark, dreadful book full of hope. At first, it's very difficult to read. The protagonist is difficult to empathize with if you don't have depression or any mental health issues. And then hope kind of bleeds in as it goes. It is a book about holding on, about discovery, about reaching out and finding the strength to connect yourself to the world around you. And I think it's absolutely beautiful. It gave me a lot of strength, a lot of empathy, a lot of what I needed at the time when I was feeling particularly depressed. Probably the lowest point I think I've ever been at in my life. And Solo Dance came along, and I am so grateful to it for that. Arthur did a splendid job translating it. It's a beautiful, beautiful novel. Go watch my review of Solo Dance. It explores queerness and migration and pride and hope and community in ways that I am just so grateful for. It's also a celebration of literature and what art and literature can do for us. The protagonist reaches out to art by people who are like her for connection, and you are doing the same thing as you read that, which is very, very clever. Beautiful, beautiful, wonderful book. But my number 1 book of 2022 so far, and I wonder when we get to the end of the year if it'll still be in the number 1 spot, that'll be interesting, is Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield, a perfect piece of British Gothic fiction. Julia Armfield is something else entirely. Our Wives Under the Sea is modern, but it is Gothic through and through. There are no castles. There are no monsters, really. It doesn't have an historical setting. It is not historical fiction. It is set now, today. But it is incredibly Gothic in its tone, its language, its atmosphere. It really takes the core, the legacy, the building blocks of Gothic fiction and manages to place it in a modern world full of electricity and light and modern invention. So often modern Gothic books are set in the past, and Julia Armfield managed to set it in the present. Not only that, but half of the book is set on a submarine. And it's a lesbian novel. Julia Armfield is a lesbian, and our protagonists are a married lesbian couple. And there is an inherent queerness to the Gothic. And she really taps into that and celebrates that union between queer community, queer art, and the Gothic as a genre. It is perfect. It is frightening, and it explores the big theme of grief. It is looking at how we grieve, and Julia Armfield is looking at the idea that we can grieve badly. I love that. This is a book about a woman who is grieving badly. She has had to grieve in the past for people she's lost, and now she's grieving again for someone she is losing, but is also technically still there, is not there, and it's looking at grief all the way through the book. Grief and loss and pain, and the ways in which we are cruel and selfish to ourselves and to each other, especially when it comes to the grieving process. It's really something else. I love Our Wives Under the Sea so, so dearly. Please read it. Okay, that was my top 10 books of the year so far. I'll be very interested to see what my top 10 books of the year look like when we get to December. I'm sure a lot of these books will be on that list. I'm very grateful to all of these authors. This has been a really great year so far. So many great pieces of fiction, and we've still got half the year to go. Subscribe for books.